Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Yvette Moy, and I'm the University of Washington's Director of Public Lectures, and our office is housed in the Graduate School, and I want to welcome you all here tonight. This evening, we will be welcoming attorney, author, political commentator, and activist George Conway. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about America's character and the rule of law. Before we bring George out onto the stage, I have a few housekeeping items to go through rather quickly. First, I really want to thank some people tonight. I'd like to start with my fellow alumnae at Trinity College, where I attended my undergraduate. That's where I met Kellyanne, his ex-wife, who connected me through the network to George, and that's how we got him here tonight. So I really want to thank Trinity and all the ladies there. Let's go, Trinity. I also want to thank the UW Alumni Association. They're such great friends and great resources for us. We love our partnership with them, and especially Amy Goodlow, I'd like to acknowledge for her work this evening. That's right. I also would like to acknowledge my really awesome colleague as well, Courtney Acitelli, who is the head of our UW Impact. That's right. Give her some love. She's great. And of course, finally, last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge our UW AA members who are joining us this evening as well. Thank you. And any other alums in the audience. Okay, on to the less exciting stuff. So if you haven't done so already, could you please silence your cellular devices? We ask that you refrain from taking any video or audio recordings of this evening's lecture. It is being recorded, and it is going to be available via live stream, and it is actually live streaming right now. You can find the recording on the Office of Public Lectures YouTube channel. While George is on stage, we ask that you refrain from taking photos. George's senior advisor is here tonight, and she's down in the front, Renee. She might be taking a couple photos because, as you know, George has some other things he's working on right now and needs the photos. You might have some questions about how to ask questions. So tonight, there are two ways that you can ask questions. The first one is you can send them in via Slido if you're joining us in person and feel a little shy, or if you're live streaming. There's a QR code that will show, if it's not right now, it's right there. And you can scan that and send your question in that way. And you can also upvote people's questions. You can also come to the microphones that are down here in the front. And the only request that we have is that when you ask your question, that you ask them in the form of a question. I'm watching. Okay, now we're going to share some background information on tonight's speaker. George Conway spent 3 decades as a litigator at the New York law firm Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, & Katz. A former long-serving member of the Federalist Society's Board of Visitors, he is now a political commentator and activist dedicated to preserving the rule of law in America. He currently serves as board president of the Society for the Rule of Law. George is also a contributing writer for The Atlantic and The Washington Post, where he has published numerous opinion pieces on law and politics. He's also a co-founder of the Lincoln Project and the Anti-Psychopath Political Action Committee. Try saying that real fast. Which focus on political accountability. Additionally, he hosts a law and politics podcast for The Bulwark, a widely read political opinion platform. So let us welcome George Conway to the stage.
Thank you all, and thank you very much for that kind introduction, Yvette. It's been an honor and a pleasure to meet so many students today at the university, not just because it was fun and stimulating, but because our future depends so much on them. But as I'm going to talk about tonight, it depends on us as well, on all of you. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to address this crowd tonight. Also, congratulations to the Seahawks. Don't tell anybody, the Giants and Jets fans back in New York. But I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan. I won't get into how that happened, but it was easy for me to root for the Seahawks in the Super Bowl because all I had to say is what I normally say at a football game, which is, "Go Birds!" And for 2 years in a row, the Birds won. But we have more serious and important things to talk about today. I know some football fans might disagree. America today faces a question that it has always faced, but with more urgency and with more uncertainty than ever before. The question was first prompted by another question, which was famously posed in Philadelphia by a woman named Elizabeth Willing Powell to one Dr. Benjamin Franklin on Tuesday, September 18, 1787, the day after the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention. To describe Eliza Powell as a socialite is accurate, but it doesn't do her justice. Sophisticated, well-read, and loquacious, she enjoyed an enduring passion for politics and was never afraid to voice her opinions. For you fans of Lin-Manuel Miranda out there, you might think of Powell as Philadelphia's own Angelica Schuyler, the sister of the more famous Eliza Hamilton. Like Angelica, Eliza Powell was deeply politically connected. I mean, this woman was wired. She was married to the last colonial mayor of Philadelphia, and in the salon of her grand home near Independence Hall, she hosted the most important figures of the Revolutionary and founding eras. Convention delegates like Franklin regularly came to her place to hang out. And so 238 years ago, on that Tuesday in Philadelphia, with the Constitution just having been signed and ready to be presented to ratification to the 13 states, Powell is said to have initiated an exchange with Franklin that has been remembered for centuries. "Well, doctor," she asked, "what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it. If you can keep it. If." That's the question. That's the other question, the most critical question. Like virtually all Americans of my generation, I had never thought that Franklin's response to Powell's question was itself a question for our times. The question of if we could keep our republic was a question then for America in 1787, because who knew what was going to happen to a brand new, fractious, debt-ridden country? Who knew whether the United States of America, then a land divided over such a fundamental matter as whether human beings could be enslaved, could even be a nation? But for Americans in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, this was all history. We knew how things turned out. We'd kept our republic and our Constitution for over 200 years. There was civil war, world wars, recessions, depressions, pandemics, and crises of all manner, large and small. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked. And on balance, it actually had gotten better, and indeed had become a model for the world, for all humanity. So how did we keep our republic for so long? The anti-federalists who opposed the adoption of the Constitution, you will recall, came up with one answer: a Bill of Rights. The Constitution was flawed, they said, because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. And it turned out that they got one. They insisted on one. The promise of one became politically essential to the ratification of the original Constitution, and the first Congress proposed it. And so 10 amendments to the Constitution, mostly guaranteeing specific individual liberties, were ratified by the states. by 1791. But a Bill of Rights, however robust or complete, and ours really isn't, actually does not assure freedom or democracy. It helps, but it doesn't guarantee that you can keep your republic. Justice Antonin Scalia liked to illustrate this point vividly. In speeches and interviews, he loved to talk about the Constitution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The last Soviet constitution, the Brezhnev Constitution it was called, was adopted in 1977. Chapters 6 and 7 of that Constitution contained at least 26 separate articles listing dozens of rights that our Constitution doesn't mention. Equal rights for women, a right to political asylum, rights to gainful employment, to free job training and education, including higher education with free textbooks, rights to free and adequate health care, to affordable housing, to environmental protection, and even to, direct quote, rest and leisure. I mean, who doesn't need a little vacay, right? Nino Scalia ate this right up. Wonderful stuff, Scalia called these provisions. But he also correctly emphasized they were not worth the paper they were printed on. As are, Scalia continued, the human rights guarantees of a large number of still extant countries governed by presidents for life. These guarantees, Justice Scalia explained, are what the framers of our Constitution called parchment guarantees, because the real constitutions of those countries, the provisions that actually establish the institutions of their governments, do not prevent the centralization of power in one man or party, thus enabling the guarantees to be ignored. Scalia's conclusion: structure is everything. His point: working in tandem, the separation of powers and federalism are what ultimately protect our liberties. This idea obviously is not new. It was the motivating, animating consensus of Ben Franklin and the delegates who met 3 blocks away from Eliza Powell's house in 1787. Here's Delegate James Madison in the Federalist number 51. In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between 2 distinct governments, and the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. That double security, established by the concurrent horizontal and vertical dispersion of political authority, has worked pretty well for a quarter of a millennium. But as America approaches its semi-quintennial, we have to ask, is that enough? Until not so long ago, I, like most everyone else, thought so. But today, I'm not, we can't be so sure. You look in the paper every day. At this point in my speech, when I drafted it, I was going to go through a litany of depredations of the rule of law, from ICE shooting protesters, killing them in Minneapolis, to DOJ cutting off funding to federal agencies created by Congress and still mandated by law, to the tariffs that were enacted pursuant to emergency authority that didn't exist and that the Supreme Court struck down just last Friday, only to have Trump invoke another statute illegally to impose reimpose tariffs. I could go on. That could be a whole separate speech. We'd be here for days. So I decided not to do that. It turns out that no more than a Bill of Rights, structural constitutional provisions don't guarantee liberty and the rule of law. What if a nation's legislature cedes its responsibilities to an executive? Sound familiar? To pick a not-so-random example, think of Germany in 1933. In March of that year, the Reichstag enacted, and forgive my attempt to pronounce the language, the Gesetz zur Behebung der Not von Volk und Reich, the law to remedy the distress of people and Reich. A statute that gave the German cabinet, and as a result gave the new chancellor, a man named Hitler, emergency powers to override the Weimar Constitution. To be sure, that law was passed after the new Nazi government unconstitutionally arrested and excluded opposition Reichstag members from voting. But there was no one to stop that. And we all know what happened next. Or what if a national government effectively destroys federalism by taking control of regional governments? Hey, that happened in Germany in 1933 too. And remember also, the USSR again. It constitutionally consisted of 15 separate, theoretically sovereign republics. These republics even had, on paper, the right to secede from the Union. But the Soviet system was never a federal system in operation and reality. So, there has to be something else that keeps constitutionalism and the rule of law alive. And I submit that it's what Judge Learned Hand called the spirit of liberty. Billings Learned Hand, that was his real name, is an icon in my profession, the legal profession, and especially in my neck of the woods, New York. He lived from 1872 to 1961, and during his last 52 years, he served as a federal judge. For 37 of those years, he served as a judge and at one point chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, which sits in New York City, one of the probably the two most prominent and important federal appeals court in which I had, as a young person, had the privilege of clerking. Learned Hand was a brilliant judicial craftsman. He was a respected legal philosopher. He is considered to be one of the greatest appellate judges ever to have graced the American bench. And frankly, even today, even though he never made it to the Supreme Court, he was considered for nomination 3 times, he commands more respect than all but a handful of the people who've actually served on the Supreme Court. But he didn't really draw much attention among the public until he was 72, when, on May 21, 1944, just over 2 weeks before D-Day, he spoke in Central Park before a huge crowd of 1.5 million people at what was then an annual event called I Am an American Day. I Am an American Day was a ginormous naturalization ceremony. 150,000 people took the oath of citizenship. Judge Hand led the 1.5 million souls in attendance as they recited the Pledge of Allegiance. But before he did that, he gave a speech for which he became famous, the spirit of liberty speech. It was short, only about 550 words. He began by saying, "We have gathered here to affirm a faith in a common purpose, a common conviction, a common devotion." Judge Hand explained that this common purpose, conviction, and devotion was what had driven so many people over the centuries to break from the past and brave the dangers and loneliness of a strange land. What was the object that nerved us or those who went before us to this choice? Hand asked. We sought liberty, freedom from oppression, freedom from want, freedom to be ourselves. This we then sought, Hand said, and this we now believe that we are by way of winning. So much winning. Hand and America in 1944 knew what real winning was. And Hand understood that this kind of winning, the preservation of liberty, required a certain human spirit that no constitution and no law could provide. What do we mean when we say that first of all we seek liberty? I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon constitutions, upon laws, and upon courts. He said, these are false hopes. Believe me, false hopes. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can do much to help it. He went on. He asked, what then is the spirit of liberty? His answer, I cannot define it. I can only tell you my faith. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the mind of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. The spirit of liberty remembers that not even a sparrow falls to the ground unheeded. The spirit of liberty is the spirit of him who, near 2,000 years ago, taught mankind that lesson it has never learned but never quite forgotten, that there may be a kingdom where the least shall be heard and considered side by side with the greatest. Hand packed so much into these words, you could spend months or years deconstructing this short speech if you tried. The last line I quoted refers to Christian belief, of course, but Hand was actually an agnostic. He was making a philosophical, a moral case for humility, truth-seeking, and tolerance. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure it is right. He made the case for empathy, the spirit which seeks to understand the mind of other men and women. He made the case for fairness and selflessness, the spirit that weighs the interests of other men and women alongside its own without bias. And with a biblical allusion, this spiritual but agnostic jurist made the case for compassion. The spirit of liberty remembers that not even a sparrow falls to the earth unheeded. Compassion for the least fortunate. finally made the case for equality and for justice, that there may be a kingdom where the least shall be heard and considered side by side with the greatest. Judge Billings' learned hand's brief but brilliant speech explains a lot about where we are today. For too many in our country have lost the spirit of liberty. Our federal government in 2026 hasn't an ounce of it. Instead of a government of humble and public-spirited officials, we see a leadership marked by arrogance and narcissism. Instead of a culture of truth-seeking, we live in a civic milieu dominated by a cynical, credulous, cultish political movement fueled by lies. Instead of empathy, we see apathy and even cruelty with political leadership that eschews mutual understanding and derides wokeness as weakness. Instead of selfishness, we see grift. In lieu of compassion, we see callousness and sadism. Instead of a federal government serving the interests of all, with public officials committed to the common good, to the rule of law, to their solemn oaths to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States, we have a government conducted by self-interested opportunists and zealots beholden to the interests, the ego, and the whims of a single man. An individual who can only accurately be described as a sociopath, utterly incapable of truthfulness and honor and decency and integrity and conscience and remorse. A megalomaniac who cares about no person other than himself, who respects no law, no rule, no norm, no code, no principle, other than what he thinks serves his ego and pocketbook at a particular fleeting moment in time. And as a result, it's not hyperbole to suggest that today we have a federal government that doesn't so much represent or resemble a federal administration as it does a family crime syndicate. There simply can be no question. The spirit of liberty in the United States of America is at its lowest ebb in our lifetimes, and perhaps ever. So how can America escape this predicament? How do we revive the spirit of liberty? And from a constitutional standpoint, how do we capture that spirit to restore our system of government to what Americans have always aspired it to be, to what we have always been taught it should be? It's a daunting task, but it's an essential task, a vital task. And upon that task, our very survival as a republic depends. As for the spirit of liberty, the underlying spirit of liberty, we often hear it said that we need better civic education. And certainly we do. To which I would add, channeling Judge Hand, better moral education. But we don't have the power to coerce people to attend remedial civics and morality schools and ethics schools, even if such schools existed. And even if we had the power to do that, we certainly don't have the time to establish such academies, let alone time to reap the benefit of them. Our republic is running out of time. We've seen the damage that a law-forsaking federal administration has wrought in just 13 months. And like many of you, I'm not sure we can survive another 35. But it turns out that Franklin and the other delegates who assembled at Independence Hall, and sometimes in Eliza Powell's well-appointed salon, devised a solution for what I believe, and I think they believe, to be a single problem. If you will, the spiritual and the constitutional solution we seek, like the spiritual and constitutional problem we face, are one and the same. The framers feared rule by an all-powerful tyrant, which is why they had revolted against a distant and, in their view, despotic monarch, and why they devoted the first and longest article of the Constitution to the establishment of a legislative branch and invested that legislature, Congress, with the sole authority to make law on a plethora of subjects. Not that they didn't also fear rule by democratic mobs. They understood that democratic government could go haywire, which is why they adopted bicameralism, federalism, the presidential veto, and ultimately a Bill of Rights. But they understood, first and foremost, the need to safeguard against usurpation of power by the executive. And so they adopted the impeachment mechanism. They feared that a president and other executive officials could steal public funds, for example. They feared that a president, whom they often called the chief magistrate of the nation, could become the cat's paw, paid or otherwise, of a foreign power. Here's an excerpt from Fran's Records of the Constitutional Convention on July 20, 1787. Mr. Madison thought it indispensable that some provision should be made for defending the community against the incapacity, negligence, or perfidy of the chief magistrate. He might pervert his administration into a scheme of speculation or oppression. He might betray his trust to foreign powers. In the case of the executive magistracy, which was to be administered by a single man, loss of capacity or corruption was more within the compass of probable events, and either of them might be fatal to the Republic. The founders meant impeachment to be a political process, but not political in the sense that we think of partisan politics today. They didn't mean for it to be a system in which, if one party controlled half the House and 2/3 of the Senate, they could just summarily vote to remove and replace the president. They also didn't mean for it to be a criminal or even purely judicial proceeding, on the other hand. They provided that judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification. And they said that a criminal trial before judges and juries in the regular courts could take place later. And so at the very end of the convention, they refused to place the decision to remove an impeached official in the hands of the Supreme Court, and instead entrusted it to the Senate. But they still meant the impeachment process to be judicious and quasi-judicial, and not the product of partisan passion or faction. They expected the Senate, to quote Hamilton in the Federalist number 65, to serve as an impartial court, as a tribunal, because they thought it would be a tribunal sufficiently dignified or sufficiently independent to serve as such. Which is why, to this day, before an impeachment trial, the rules of the Senate require members to take an oath affirming that in all things appertaining to the impeachment trial, he or she will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help me God. In other words, to do justice under the law, the Constitution, and pursuant to the evidence without regard to personal interest or political loyalty. And as Hamilton put it, impeachment was designed to be a method of national inquest. He capitalized those words, all caps, into the conduct of public men, including and especially the president. Those words, national inquest, come from British parliamentary history, where the House of Commons was said to represent and constitute, in matters of impeachment, the grand inquest of the nation, by which, sitting like a grand jury, the House would review evidence impartially, carefully, thoughtfully, pursuant to law, not with the political passion that ordinarily attends the legislative process. This is where the framers intended for us to teach civics, to perform that civic education that we need so desperately today. They meant the process of impeachment and removal not simply to be the practical mechanism by which a despotic or law-breaking government or president or official could be removed. They meant it to be a way to rekindle and make use of the spirit of liberty. By involving the people's representatives in the process, they involve the public in the process. And again, not through partisan passion, but by setting standards for constitutional behavior, by reviewing evidence of constitutional depredation. They didn't intend impeachment to be a mechanism for political warfare, but they did intend for it to be an exercise in self-government. And so, we face circumstances in which, if the impeachment mechanism can't be applied successfully, if the spirit of liberty can't be rekindled to restore constitutional and law-abiding government in the United States, then we will not have kept our republic. We might as well throw out Article 1 of the Constitution, the article creating Congress, for it will not have done its duty and solemn constitutional obligation. And as such, we might as well throw out the entire Constitution. But it's a daunting task. It's a huge responsibility and duty for members of Congress. And to get to the point where Congress can reassert its required, obligated role under the Constitution to hold executive officials, including the president, responsible for their high crimes and misdemeanors, it requires the spirit of liberty that does exist still, that I think is growing in the United States. The spirit of liberty that I think attends people in this audience. And the way that can happen is for all of us to think of the lessons that Judge Hand, that what he taught, when he talked to those people at Central Park in 1944 about steadfastness and courage and decency and truth-telling and humility. The spirit of liberty requires moral courage among the people who are elected to Congress, who take the oath to serve as members of Congress under the Constitution, to uphold the constitutional laws of the United States, but it also requires all of us. It requires us to speak out without fear. It requires us to tell others unpleasant truths that they do not want to hear. It requires us to march on the streets, to vote, to organize, to ensure that the spirit of liberty spreads and lives and finds its way into the Congress of the United States. But it's not just activism and organizing and the moral courage of, like the immigrants going to a strange and uncertain land that we are facing in fighting for our democracy. It requires some forbearance on our part, some humility on our part, some empathy on our part for those people who now see what many of us have seen for a long time, or beginning to see. I started on so many highbrow notes, I'll start on a lower brow note. I'll finish on a lower brow note. Think of that Saturday Night Live skit from a couple of weeks ago. Did you see it? With the mom and the family. The mom was a Trumper, and she's sitting there and saying, I have something to say. And the kids are like, well, what is it, Mom? You need to not say anything. And she didn't want them to say, you see, Ma, we told you. And they started to do it as she started to tell them how she realized that she was wrong. But in the end, they held their tongues. And she got it out. And that's important forbearance that also reflects the spirit of liberty. Because this rekindling of the spirit of liberty, this restoration of our democracy and our republic, the saving of our republic, requires that humility and that forbearance. Because it's hard for people to admit they made a mistake. It's harder for people to admit they made a grievous mistake. And as so many people become more and more aware of the mistake that they made, those of us who have been pointing out the mistake for so long need to say, welcome. Welcome. Thank goodness we are in this together. It is our common devotion, our common cause, as Learned Hand said, our common faith that America must be governed by the rule of law, not the rule of men. And that is how we can rekindle, expand, and grow the spirit of liberty. And that, I submit, is how we can and must keep our republic. I thank you for your attention. Thank you. We have questions. All right, I have some questions. They're on this iPad, and I also think there are questions that can be posed at the microphone. So let's.
Democratic leadership seems about as popular as a root canal right now. As you enter,
No comment.
As you enter that club, how do you envision getting them back on the side of being more popular and more leaders?
I mean, I think it's very difficult to be a legislative leader. I mean, one of the reasons why I thought about running for public office was, and I kind of felt guilty sitting in the cheap seats, lobbing bombs. You know, it's a difficult thing, running for public office. Something, you know, in 62 years never occurred to me to do. I never wanted to do it. And it's something that I would not do under any other circumstance. And something, you know, serving in public is something I won't and can't do for very long. So I sympathize with legislative leaders who have to herd cats, herd their members, and bring together groups of people who, you know, may not all have the same character, may not all have the same way of thinking, may not agree on things, and try to get them to act in a unified manner. And the way I think people can help is by voting in and electing more people who will push the leadership, who will move the center of gravity of a caucus, and who will make these arguments about right and wrong, about evidence and justice, and the proper role of a constitutional officer of the United States. And I think that's the only way. And I think that, you know, leadership, there's leadership that comes from the top, but there's also an impetus that comes from all of us and people who decide to go into public life. And that's the only solution I can think of, because as Learned Hand said, it's not the courts that are going to save us. They can't. Any other people standing? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I am grateful to be introduced to Judge Learned Hand and so much more of what you have taught me tonight.
He's rolling in his grave, I tell you.
I'm wondering if you see, let me back up quickly. You may be aware that Seattle voters will be using ranked choice voting for the first time next year. Seattle is moving to improve elections in that way. And I'm wondering if you see a role for systemic electoral reforms such as ranked choice voting, proportional representation, in your imagination for how we can rekindle that spirit of liberty. And in particular, are you familiar, as you potentially get ready to enter Congress, I hope you win, of the Fair Representation Act that has been introduced in Congress that would specifically address the way that Congress, we elect the House of Representatives, which currently, as we all know, those are just not competitive elections around the country. Do you see a role for proportional?
Is that an act that would expand the size of the House?
It would not expand the size of the House, that particular act. That is Jamie Raskin and Representative Don Beyer who've introduced that one. That one would switch to multi-winner districts for the same 435 members of Congress. But, for example, instead of in Washington State where we have 10 single-member districts, that would merge 5 and 5 and elect 5 members from each district using proportional representation.
Yeah, I am in favor of electoral reforms that would result in less political polarization and result in fewer safe seats, one-party seats. And ranked choice voting can do that. Jungle primaries, maybe, I don't know. I'm not really a political scientist who has studied that. But I absolutely believe that the two things that have to happen in the next Congress or two is first, accountability, which involves investigating, conducting the grand inquest, and removing miscreant public officials. And then there has to be something of a second American Reconstruction that involves such reforms. But we can't get to that until we finish job one. But absolutely, I mean, I think we have to look at those possibilities to, I mean, multi-member districts would mean that people have to compromise, that they have to consider voting for candidates they disagree with. They have to, people have to run more to the middle than to the extremes. And one of the problems that we have is that the single-member districts have resulted in political polarizing and gerrymandering. Another solution, as we just discussed, is the expanding of the size of the House of Representatives, because the more seats you have, the smaller the districts are, the less they can be politically gerrymandered. Although I do wonder how a House of Representatives could function with 800 or 900 members or however many it might have. That being said, the House of Commons has, 600 plus members? I don't know. That's something that has, all these things have to be considered. And, but also there are other aspects, important aspects of what I think would be a second American Reconstruction. And those would be safeguards on the limiting the power of the executive to do things like order political prosecutions, withhold money that has been appropriated by Congress, and so many other things. So, yeah, I mean, there's just a whole, there's a whole books full of, there have been books that have been written about what we need to do, but we can't get there.
You sound as though you may have read the Our Common Purpose report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences.
I haven't. I have read a book.
I commend that to you also.
Okay, I will commend that book. I also commend a book that was written in 2020 by Jack Goldsmith of Harvard Law School, a former Republican member of the DOJ, and a man who was, and Bauer, I forgot his first name, Bob Bauer, who was a White House counsel in the Obama administration. They had a lot of good proposals, but we need all that and more on steroids, frankly.
Do you believe that social media and video sharing has eliminated any chance of a common understanding of democratic values and a shared bank of information and truth? And if so, do you think we can find our way back?
Well, it certainly hasn't helped. Obviously, there has been siloing of people into their little own information worlds, and people are selectively choosing the narratives and the information sources that appeal to their predispositions. I don't know how you can necessarily remedy that through law. Even apart from the First Amendment, the technology will always be there. There are suggestions, for example, that we could regulate algorithms. That probably is constitutional. How we would do that, tricky. But yeah, I mean, we have to think about that. But what it really requires, again, is the spirit of liberty among all of us to say what's on our minds, to speak the truth, even when somebody at the other side of the coffee shop or the Thanksgiving dinner table doesn't want to hear it.
Hi, George. We have some questions from online.
Okay.
I'm going to go with the most popular one,
Okay.
which comes from Anonymous, but had 17 votes. That question is, what can be done when Trump invokes the Insurrection Act a few days before the midterm election and sends troops into blue precincts to depress voting there?
Yeah, that's a scary scenario and a very good question. And the answer is to get out there, vote early, get other people to go out and vote early. And if they do that, get out on the streets. There's no other choice. Yes, sir.
So I have a question about, so I believe in grace and accountability, both. And my question is, this current administration has had corruption and grift of breathtaking proportion, coupled with equally breathtaking incompetence. I believe that there needs to be accountability, which involves a significant amount of impeachments taking place. But I worry if we impeached every person that deserves to be impeached in this administration, we would never finish the process in our lifetime.
Oh, I have an idea.
Okay, perfect. That's what I want to hear.
I have an idea. I mean, I was a civil lawyer, and this is, but they have this in the criminal realm too, the federal civil rules of civil procedure and the federal rules of criminal procedure allow for joinder of cases, which means you don't have to sue one person who conspired with others to deprive you of your rights separately, each one separately. You can sue them all at once. And if you're a federal prosecutor, you can bring a mob case. And in fact, it seems to me efficient, and both serve the pedagogical purpose that I described that impeachment serves by having one trial of all of them. I'm serious. Because why do we have to present the evidence more than once? They're all in this together. So, we can do this. Okay, Yvette, shoot.
Okay, George. Okay, this is the second most popular question that's come in from Sean H., voted up 17 people. Do you believe the greatest threat in today's political climate comes from the specific political actors or from broader structural weaknesses in our institutions?
I think I answered that with the speech. I think the institutions as written on paper are fine. I think the problem is, yes, individual actors, and yes, not just individual actors at the highest reaches of the current federal syndicate, but also, people up and down the political system. It requires the rekindling of the spirit of liberty. And that's the problem. And I'm not saying there can't be structural reforms, constitutional reforms that could make the system better. I can think of quite a few. But in the first instance, we need to live up to our heritage of standing up for what is right. Yes, ma'am.
What role has big money and corporate donations played in exacerbating political polarization and corruption within our current system? And what can be done in order to combat that or deal with that in light of the Citizens United case?
Yeah, I understand the criticism of Citizens United. I understand the rationale behind Citizens United. I honestly don't think that it is our central problem. Because we kept our republic for 200 plus years, almost 200 years, before the Federal Election Campaign Act was even enacted. And absolutely there was corruption. Absolutely there was money in politics. Absolutely unlimited donations under the table. We had that for a very long time. And we had corruption in government. But we never had the degree of corruption we have today because people stood up to it, whether it be political opponents or the people. And for that reason, I think the problem runs actually deeper. I do think I agree that there is an aggravating factor, but it's been worse previously, and the Republic has been better previously, although never perfect and never completely devoid of corruption. Next question.
I'm afraid impeachment is a dead letter today.
Afraid of what?
Impeachment, that route,
yeah.
Given the Congress that we have. How do you view that as a viable path to accountability?
Well, we have no choice. It has to be. It's what impeachment was there for. And I think one of the problems that we have, and I don't mean to be critical of the party that I have joined, but there is, among some people who feel the same way I do about Donald Trump, a kind of learned helplessness. Oh, we did it twice. We couldn't get it done. We can't do it again. We just have to wait it out. We don't have that luxury. We don't have that choice. We have to get out there and redouble our efforts. Every single one of us has. Every single one of us has a role to play in some manner, whether it be standing up for particular candidates, writing or calling particular representatives, marching on the streets. It's up to us, and we can't give up. And if we don't succeed, we need to leave it all out on the field. Sir.
You so brilliantly used the word liberty tonight. I find myself forced to ask, why don't you run on the Libertarian Party ticket? Or at least how seriously can we take the Libertarian Party? Or what do you think of the future of the Libertarian Party? Certainly it's not if I vote Libertarian, I'm not wasting my vote.
Yeah, no, look, we have a system because, we talked about single-member districts a moment ago. Because we have single-member districts and first-past-the-post voting, our political system equilibrates at two political parties. There are moments in time where new parties can arise and old parties can disintegrate, as we saw before the Civil War with the Whig Party and the rise of the Republican Party. And I think we may very well be seeing the beginning of that today, because I don't think that the current Republican Party will survive the end of Donald Trump's administration. And that as a result, there will be a political vacuum that will be filled by another party, whatever that may be, however it may be constituted. And we don't really know I think we can't predict what our two-party system, we will still have a two-party system unless, I don't know, maybe some radical reform of Congress takes place that makes us more like a Italy or a UK or an Israel. We will have two parties, but I don't think they will be the same two parties, and I think we're already seeing now kind of an exchange of the electorate we've been seeing for several years, where many voters who were Republicans have become independents or Democrats, and many Democrats, people who voted Democrats, people who voted for Obama, voted for Trump and became Republicans. And we are seeing some kind of a tectonic shift in the party system, and I wouldn't dare predict how it's going to come out. All I know is we have to survive the next two cycles. Ma'am, I guess this will be it. I guess one last question.
I have a question that I know the answer to, but I still want to hear your
Well, why don't you tell us the answer and I'll do the question. We'll do this like Jeopardy.
The answer is it's no good. Don't eat the cookie. And it's about political violence.
What?
About political violence.
Yes.
And I know you love impeachment as the answer and democracy, but, we live in this time, Charlie Kirk and Nancy Pelosi in Minnesota, and a lot of my friends and I, we're just like, yes, gosh darn it, we wish that someone would just cut the head off the snake, or, right? People kind of want them just to kind of die, right? So what is your response to that? Because I want to be humble, and I want this spirit and be a good person. So what do you say to
I think we have to follow the example of Dr. King. We have to stand up peacefully. I don't think there's any other way. I think the evil forces that run our government today want there to be violence. They want to provoke violence. It's why they sent masked men without badges, wearing camouflage to the streets of Minneapolis and Portland. And I think the answer is more people standing up, showing moral courage and, yes, physical courage to stand up to this administration, including the frogs in Portland, who I thought were great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us this evening. See you soon. Come back. Another lecture. Yay!